We will begin the lunch and learn shortly. We will be beginning the lunch and learn shortly. Oh. As people join the webinar, we are so thrilled at moving forward with this topic. My name is Sharon Roberson. I'm president and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. Our mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Today's topic, blocked from the ballot, comes at a very critical juncture in our nation's history. We have had elections at the local level here in Nashville and Davidson County, at the state level, and at the national level. And the conversation is all around voting. We know that universal suffrage is a cornerstone of democratic governance. We also know that levels of criminal punishment has risen in the United States. And this means that many of our citizens have been lost. They have lost the right to vote. Looking at the macro level, we know that around the world, we are only one of 4 countries that do not allow for post-release, that have post-release restrictions, that is, on the right to vote. And that is amazing considering this overriding desire of this country to have voting as a right, or the overall ideals of this country would lead us to believe that voting should be a right post-release. We're having this conversation today because there is an interface between the failure of individuals having the right to vote, the felon population or ex-felon population, the felon population disenfranchisement, and that democratic governance, which involves the right to vote. One thing I want to level set, at the YW, we have these conversations because it is very important that we invite, not indict individuals. There are those that will be curious about this conversation. There are those that may disagree with some of the things that we discuss. But we want to make sure we give our community the tools to have valid conversations around this very critical issue. We want to thank Nissan Foundation for making these webinars possible. This conversation, as I said, we are building community. We are getting issues out so that individuals can have these sorts of critical conversations. We also want to thank the Harnish Foundation, and they have been a force behind having not only these conversations, but also they will be sponsoring our annual Stand Against Racism rally, which will be on the courthouse steps starting tomorrow at 11:30 to 1. So if you are downtown Nashville at that time of day, please come by. We have a rally, and we're really organizing the community on the issue of gun violence as it applies to our community, and also looking at us taking a public stand against racism in the community. So I'm excited for these panelists. They are those that are looking at this issue from an educational perspective, from an advocacy perspective, and also from the perspective of individuals that are dedicating themselves to support those who have been left out of our systems. I will ask each of them to introduce themselves and how they fit into this very complicated puzzle of felon disenfranchisement. I'll start with Dr. Kristen Budd. Could you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a cold, so hopefully everybody can hear me okay. My name is Dr. Kristen Budd. I'm a research analyst here at the Sentencing Project. So we're a research-driven advocacy organization that is based in Washington, D.C. And part of our mission is to make sure that everyone has the right to vote, regardless of their criminal legal involvement. So hopefully I can bring some knowledge to the panel today from that perspective. So thanks for having me, and thank you for attending.
All right, Stephanie Harris.
Okay, let me get myself off of the camera.
No worries.
Acting brand new over here. But you can hear me, so start video. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Stephanie Harris with MDHA, Metropolitan Development and Housing Agency, and I work with a lot of our residents who have criminal backgrounds, and I work with them with assisting with expungement. That's how I got involved with this movement. And what I do mostly, I started off as community engagement, and that was to make sure our residents had opportunities in construction training and construction going on at MDHA, and making sure that the inside and outside communities knew what was going on our property, and making sure that they were aware that the inside community is our priority. And then moved on into barrier removal, because as we started the Section 3 work readiness program with construction, there were barriers. There were transportation barriers. There were, because of driver's license or lack thereof, people couldn't get certain jobs because they had criminal backgrounds, hence the move into the expungement. And that led into trying to convince a lot of our residents who have, for many reasons, don't feel the need to vote. So with that, and with the barriers that are provided, we're able to illustrate to them why it's very important to vote. And a lot of the positions that they find themselves in is because of the laws that are currently in place. And so that's what I'm here to talk about, and I'm happy to be here, and I hope I can contribute well. Have a good one.
All right. Mr. Kareem Creighton, could you please introduce yourself and tell us how you fit into this complicated puzzle?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kareem Creighton. I am a lawyer and political scientist, but I serve at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, based in New York, but also with DC offices where I am. And my role is Senior Director of Voting Rights and Representation, and my job is to manage teams whose work it is to make certain that our democracy is one that hears everyone, that respects everyone, and has the interests they offer reflected in law and policy. And that includes people who have records that have involved the criminal justice system. We don't think that that should be a permanent disqualifier for your participation. And to the extent that the state has a system that is allowing you to get back into the system, that ought to be clear and actually accessible. So we work, among the many things we do, we work on a lot of efforts to try to streamline that process where a process exists. We have been one of the principal movers in the state of Florida, for example, and the ongoing effort to make certain that people with past records, alongside, of course, the in-state actors who've actually been on the front lines of this, but helping them to make certain that they have the best in legal research and representation to make the case that the government should be doing everything that they can to bring people into the political system and not keep people fenced out. So it's a real delight to be here. I was just in Nashville last week. I'm excited to see where this conversation takes us today.
All right, and Ms. Dawn Harrington. Please introduce yourself, and thank you again. Dawn has been a member of a previous panel, and we always love to have her and hear her perspective.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Sharon. My name is Dawn Harrington. I am the executive director of Free Hearts. Free Hearts is an organization that's led by formerly incarcerated women, and we organize families impacted by incarceration all across the state of Tennessee. And so we got into this issue, one, because of who we are. Actually, when we first started working on voting rights, I myself also didn't have my voting rights. And actually, I always say about our Free the Vote campaign, I'm not only the executive director, but I was a client, because it took me 9 years to get my voting rights back because of the process. And really just because we were doing the process, that's how I learned to get my voting rights back. And actually it was because I was featured in a national story and they asked for comment. However, not everybody's going to have a national story to help them get their voting rights back. The system is inherently flawed. And we work with thousands of people all across the state of Tennessee in trying to get their voting rights back from every single county. And we saw so many issues with the process and filed a procedural due process claim that's still ongoing in federal court. We also have pending legislation and a Free the Vote coalition with other organizations as well in this state. And we just had a Free the Vote convening Sunday and Monday, where people came from 25 counties across the state. So we really care about this issue. We're really excited about this conversation. And that's my intro.
All right, thank you. We'll go back to you, Dr. Budd. I talked about when we started this conversation about how the United States, believe it or not, is one of only 4 of the nations that are actually surveyed with post-release restrictions on voting. Even one of those 4, Belgium, is only if your sentence was over 7 years. So we're really in the minority, but we always see ourselves as leaders in the world, at the world stage. But on this particular issue, it's difficult. We also know that felony convictions are disproportionately affect people of color in this country, and there's a connection there. What I'd like for you to give us some of your insights into how felon disenfranchisements, how is it working as far as the interconnection of that and people of color in our community?
So if I'm following the question appropriately, so please chime in if I'm going off on the wrong direction. But we are definitely an international outlier here in the United States when it comes to voting rights and the number of people that we have taken voting rights away from. So in the United States, we're looking at roughly a little over 4.6 million individuals. Primarily, many of those individuals are people of color. So we have seen the dilution of political power within those specific communities. And we see a direct tie to mass incarceration, right? So 2023 is the 50 years of mass incarceration that we're marking here in the US. So the Sentencing Project is shining a light on that, and that is also directly tied right to this trajectory we've seen with felony disenfranchisement here. So if you want just a wee bit of historical perspective, right? So, you know, contemporarily, people can tell you, right, these are race neutral. So anyone who's convicted of a felony, right, depending on what state you live in, these laws would apply. But when you look at that historical perspective, we see these are grounded in, right, keeping certain power structures in place. And with the founding of this nation, who had the power, right? White male property owners, okay? So, you know, as we evolved over time, this is a very high level overview, there was still that movement to keep what, you know, those individuals defined as these quote unquote undesirable social groups. So I'm a sociologist by trade, so you might see some of that language coming out here from voting. So it was people of color, it was women, it was the poor, right? So there were those roadblocks put up throughout history until those groups one by one were getting re-enfranchised. But, we have historical documentation. So we've got legislative testimony, we've got constitutional conventions where specific statements were made, right? We literally do not want, Black community members to be able to vote, right? Whatever state it may be. So you do see that, but the United States is unique, right? We have 50 different stories essentially about felony disenfranchisement, but you can definitely very much strongly make the argument that that story is tied together through the thread of race, right? It's sewn together through that racial narrative, even though we've seen it develop differently in those states. So for these different types of laws, you really start to see them spread during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, right? Which once again ties to that growth of mass incarceration. So just another mechanism historically to keep those in power who were your white male property owners. So I don't know if any of our other panelists might want to chime in to round out.
Mr. Creighton, you look at this issue, you examine this issue, and this is important, I think, for our audience to recognize, because we're not only talking about something that appears neutral on the face, we're talking about something that has a disparate impact on certain members of society. And what Dr. Budd is saying, this was intentional. We have the historical documentation that says this was an intentional strategy to keep certain populations from being able to vote. Can you give us some more flavor on that?
Well, I think that history is a apt read of what we all know is true from our origins, although obviously we are also fighting an effort to make sure that that can be told in our schools and the like. But I actually think it's also something that we grapple with some in the law. We all know that there is a history prior to and in the immediate aftermath of formalized slavery in this country, that once African Americans were, at least as a formal matter in the Constitution, permitted, in fact, required to be qualified to participate in the democratic system, a lot of states, Tennessee being among them, particularly those in the former Confederacy, moved when they had the opportunity to limit that access. And part of the scheme, there were many parts of it, but one of those important parts of the scheme was to adopt rules that would essentially penalize people who had been declared guilty of crimes, and sometimes they were randomly assigned crimes that would prevent them from participating in elections, described at the time as civil death. And the aim was absolutely clear. The challenge, and I just want to make certain that we're clear about one of the reasons why this is such a challenge in our courts is, notwithstanding this obsession that we currently have with originalism, there is a unwillingness to impute what we know to be true of the people who founded these provisions in state constitutions to the modern day practice of using those disqualification statutes. And the reasons are many. And we think, I personally, and I think our organization takes the view that that kind of originalism is flawed. But it's certainly the case that we are living with the legacy of these intentionally discriminatory rules. And the challenge we have in courts now is to try to help courts understand that, notwithstanding the fact that time has passed, and yes, that we've dismantled some of the more offensive elements of our constitutional system in many of these states, it still is true that the consequences of those structures, even if race isn't mentioned, as I think Dr. Budd mentioned earlier, those are still heavily felt. And as much as we can talk about contemporary policing and sentencing and its racially disparate effects, we're still living with a structure that was bent on making certain that people, once they're in the system and convicted of a crime, don't get the opportunity to come back in. And that's really one of the challenges. I'll sort of give you one example just briefly to say that even though we've run into these challenges about trying to make the disparate effects argument, a lot of courts have taken different approaches. So one of them is, for example, out of the Fifth Circuit, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, where the Fifth Circuit out of Mississippi looks at Mississippi's felony disqualification law and says, all right, we know that we can't really, because of our case law, approach the question of the discriminatory effects of the plan. So we're going to say instead, we're going to look at this through the lens of cruel and unusual punishment, which really turns right into that point that you both, Dr. Budd, and others were making. I think, Ms. Robinson, you started with this about being an outlier in the world when it comes to disqualifying people. And in that case, not only is the court talking about the fact that we're out of step with most of the world, even within this country, the trend is moving away from permanent disbarment from participating in elections. And so where you look at that sort of trend, rules that sort of keep people from really getting back in an easy manner are out of step, and therefore are really not consistent with what we commonly think of appropriate punishment in a civilized society.
Yes, thank you very much. And what we're getting to is that how things are viewed as normal. We have normalized the idea, well, once you commit some sort of crime, then you lose the right to vote. And everyone's thinking that that is normal. But if you look at this thing globally, it is certainly not normal. Now we're going to look at things even in the state of Tennessee, where this YW is. And Stephanie, your boots on the ground, you're working with individuals. Give your perspective on how the disproportionate number of people of color that are part of the criminal justice system and how that affects the work that you're doing.
Thank you. It's considerable. Our population is definitely tied right into this, because not only are they their voting rights restricted once they are released, but child support accumulates while they're in prison. And Tennessee is one of only 4 to 5 states in the country that allows back child support to also preclude you from voting if you have indeed paid your fines and you're not on probation or parole, which I will probably be referred to as on paper, because that's where I hear it most often. So if you hear that, that's what that means. And then they can go to court and have the child support that accumulated while they were in prison removed, but that's a whole nother process that they're required to go through. And then back child support, and I've called the Election Commission to ask this question, because so many of them come out and they get on payment arrangements with their child support, and they remain current on those payments. But as long as back money is owed, they're still not allowed to reinstate their voting rights. And so it really puts them in this position of hopelessness. And not only that, I mean, they come out with tens of thousands of dollars owed in jail fees and court fines. So they come out and they're required to get a job by their probation or parole officer. So, which is difficult with their lack of transportation, and they're so limited. But then they do get a job and they're paying taxes, but then they have no voice into where their tax dollars go. And that just further, when I tell you the hope, just start, you can see it start to seep from them, because there is a no to them at every single turn. The only bright spot in all of this in the last 6 or 7 years, I can say, is somebody came to me when I worked at Jump with a jail ID. So he came out of jail with no ID. That was it. Just this piece of paper that said who he was and he'd been to prison. And so we began arguing for the state to go in and at least let them come out with a state ID. I mean, they know who they are, you know. So, and then a lot of the times they'd come out of prison with no birth certificate, no social security card, because things had transitioned in their lives and their friends and families' lives while they were away. So it's devastating to watch. And the bright spot for me is being able to remove some of the barriers and watch some of the hope return, and tell them, you know, that we always, when we do events with MDHA, we always have voter rights restoration and registration. And so many felons don't even think it's a possibility, when in fact it's only murder, rape, voter fraud, and treason that will preclude someone, if they can, you know, hop through all the other barriers, from restoring their right to vote. So, but, you know, so the hope is, and my hope is that more felons recognize the right to vote, bringing in ex-felons who can tell the people, you know, my residents, how important it is that they vote, and why some of the laws are as they are, and what happens at midnight when they, you know, increase the non-expungible crime list. All of those things, that is where what I see, and where they, you know, everyone needs a buy-in as far as why this population should be allowed to vote.
Now, Dawn, this is a wake-up call for many of us, because you see the uphill battle. You've been through this battle. You've been battling it a long time. Give us your perspective as a woman of color, and maybe why people just give up and is not something that they want to carry on the fight for.
Yes. So first of all, just wanting to say Tennessee has the #1 impact in the entire country of felony disenfranchisement on Black and Latino voters, the #1 in the whole entire country. And we also, just in Nashville, we have the #1 incarceration rate zip code in the whole country for people born between in the 80s. And so this really impacts us. So as a person, as a Black woman, the barriers are extremely hard, and they actually just made it even worse. Besides, having the most complex voter restoration process of any country, of any state, that just became worse. Besides being the one of only a handful of states, well, the only state that connects child support to the franchise, the only one, despite being one of only just a handful of states that connects any type of financial obligations to the franchise, or that permanently disenfranchises anyone. And despite the fact that we already had almost 500,000 people disenfranchised before this new rule, in July, our elections, Department of Elections actually added something even more to the process than we did. So when I was going through the process, I had to I had a conviction that was out of state. So we have a certificate of restoration application form that you have to take to the arresting authority and basically to the court clerk and the probation office, but it's not clear. They have to fill it out. Well, the state that I was incarcerated in, they have automatic voting restoration. And so had I would have been living there, I would have automatically got my voting rights back. But instead, at the time, what I had to do, and I'll talk about what you have to do now, which is even worse. But at the time, what I had to do was take our certificate of restoration paper. And at that time, I was doing day labor. I had to build up the money in order to go to New York, try to take this paper around, try to figure out, first of all, who is the arresting authority. I tried to go to the police department. They were like, we don't know anything about this. I went to Rikers Island, where I was incarcerated. They didn't want to fill out the paper. I went to the court, and they sent me to parole, where I was never on parole, but I did this long interview with them, and they gave me a court date to come back. So again, I had to come up with the money, come back out there, go in front of the same judge that I went in front of in the first place. And at the end of it, they gave me a certificate of something like employability or something like that, that was for the state of New York, and they still didn't fill out my form. And so that's why it took me so long to do this, because I gave up because I didn't know what to do. And really, it wasn't until we started doing this as the organization, so we formed the organization and started doing this as the organization all across the state, and being able to lift these stories up nationally, to where, the reporter actually that was talking about my story actually is the one who called me back, because they were trying to get a comment, and said that I was going to get my paperwork filled out. And again, I don't blame the state of New York for this. They give people their voting rights back immediately when they get out. It's the state of Tennessee for requiring me to do this. But the process already is so difficult and intentionally confusing. It's also, what we've seen is there's so much misinformation, because again, we do this in every single one of our 95 counties. We work with people on getting their voting rights back. And what we see is that it's a roll of the dice of if you're going to get the right information or not. People have gotten their rights restored and switched counties, and then they've torn up the paperwork to switch the county, saying you will never vote in this county, even though they already got their voting rights back. There's people that say that you have to pay all of your fines and everything, but you only have to pay court costs and restitution. There's some people that'll say that we had a period between the early 70s and the early 80s to where nobody lost their voting rights. And before this process changed in July, those folks could just go register to vote, and they were being told that they could not, they would have to go through the process. So again, it's just so much misinformation, so much like the process is inherently flawed, and we would like to say intentionally flawed. In addition to that, now, as a result of the Falls v. Goin case and really a misinterpretation of the decision, which it was a bad decision. However, the interpretation of the decision by the elections division, they have issued a new rule that basically is making it even harder to get your rights to vote than when I just went through it, which is to where it's everybody's permanently disenfranchised except for extraordinary and discretionary action from either the governor or the courts. So that means that first they're going to have to either go through the pardon process, which I'm not going to get all into it, but the short version is that you have to fill out a whole bunch of things. You have to get all this paperwork. You have to get several letters of support. You have to write a narrative, then you have to just turn it in, and you don't have to get it notarized and everything. You turn it in, and then it's just a waiting period. They don't have to respond. There is no timetable. They don't have to do anything with it. They don't have to give you any. It's just you turn it in, and it's rare that you get it, and you just wait. That's one pathway that you have to do before you even get to the certificate of restoration process. On the other side, you can go through the restoration of citizenship rights. So this is the way that that you could have done to get your right to sit on a jury back, get your right to run for public office back. You could also go through that to get your right to get your voting rights back through this court process. But now you have to go through this. But But first of all, it's not free. In Davidson County, for example, it costs $159.50. Another reason it's not free is because they don't have pro se options. The only district that has pro se options, meaning you can do it yourself, it has something on their website for it, is the 10th district, which includes Bradley County, and then Hamilton County has it on the 10th district's one on their website. But outside of that, all of the other judicial districts, there is no pro se option for doing this on their site. You have to actually go get an attorney, because it's a complex legal process that you have to do. And at the end of the day, once you go in front of the judge, put your evidence together, and then once you go in front of them, the judge can say yes or they can say no. So again, this is what they put in front of the process, which was already flawed and already horrible and already had us number one for the impact of Black people in this country, as well as Latino people in this country, and already had us almost disenfranchising 500,000 people. Now they put even more of a barrier in front of people. And even we've been talking a lot with clerks, judges, even they are trying to really figure out how this is going to work.
Okay. Well, Stephanie, tell us a little bit about Harris. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your camp, because it seems that there's a level of confusion. So people differ on what's required and what's not. Give us a little flavor for what we're looking at as far as the process.
It's very, very similar to what Dawn described. I want to touch bases on that $159 fee. And Dawn can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's relatively new. The criminal court clerk's office called me shortly before Stephen contacted me. And the clerk's office told me about this fee and said he had somebody who had gone through the entire process of paying off their court costs and fees and fines, paying off the probation, parole fees and fines, had gotten all the paperwork cleared, and there's a piece of paper for every single felony that you've got on your record, and you rarely just get one or two when you get charged with some crimes. So he asked if the grants that I have are pretty flexible, allow me to pay for reinstatement fees, tickets, court costs, anything that will help somebody reinstate their license or get something expunged from their record, because there used to be a fee for that as well. And asked if we could cover the $159 fee. And without even calling any manager that I had, I was like, absolutely, we're gonna cover that. And so then when I went to my manager, I was like, well, I already committed. And I said, if you say no, then I'm gonna have to line up some people in my community that will be willing to catch these fees. If in the event that the criminal court clerks calls and has somebody that is ready, and that's their only barrier to restoring their rights to vote. But they are continually making it more difficult, and that's part of the confusion. You know, it changes all the time, and of course, I don't know, it's not advertised anywhere that okay, well, we used to be able to allow to do this, and now we're not. And one of the things I would suggest that if anyone does any voter registration or restoration fairs or festivals is to have the Tennessee Department of Correction present, because they can check to see if fees and fines are owed. It's very difficult to find someone's parole or probation officer once you've been out for a while. And then you go through the system and they don't know who to send you to. They don't know what piece of paper that you're talking about that you need and all this kind of thing. So if you have the Tennessee Department of Correction there and your crimes are in Tennessee, then they can complete that paperwork for you at that registration or restoration fair. The other thing that I like to do is to tie it into something that people are interested in, you know, so oftentimes we'll have one of our events or parties here, you know, that celebrates our residents, celebrates holidays and that kind of thing. And that brings out people that ordinarily would not come to a voter registration or restoration event, where we can get the information out that, yes, indeed, you can restore your right to vote. Here is the process. And then a lot of times it's up to me to advocate for them in, you know, various places or in various courts to say, yes, this can be done, because they're the first, you know, people, they're the first line of defense when someone goes to the clerk's office and they're like, no, you can't do that. You know, and that's what they tell us. That's what they tell my folks. No, and it's not always, so it might be no to that particular question, and our residents don't always know the right question to ask. So there's not a no, you can't do that, but you can do this. And so there's so many times that they need advocacy and further information, and to be able to ask the next question. Because it's the whole process, as Dawn said, is constantly changing, and it's not changing to make it easier.
All right, well, Mr. Creighton, we know the roots of the racism roots of these kind of practices. Why do you think that they continue? Why do these persist? Why are there new laws coming on board that may actually make things more difficult to get your voting rights reinstated?
Well, before I say that, let me just say how I am so thankful to have heard the testimony from the people who are actually experiencing how difficult these processes are. You know, we can talk about numbers, and, you know, people on this panel clearly are skilled at that, but it really means something much more powerful when you hear what it takes for a person to go through the process. So I just really wanted to just stop and acknowledge that fact. To your question, there are many reasons why I think people continue this process, knowing that it has these effects on people. And I'll just give you at least a cluster of them. I'm sure, you know, others will have their thoughts too. The first thing to note is there's this sort of broad consideration that I think is not something that people have thought through, because they wouldn't apply it to themselves. And that's just a notion that the vote is sort of a privilege and not a right. And everybody says that until it comes to them, which is to say, it's perfectly fine to impose difficulties on other people because you say, well, the right is so important, or privilege, as some people would have it, you should be willing to work for it. But of course, very few people would do what Ms. Harrington described that it would take to qualify to vote. In fact, people would complain, right? They'd go to their elected officials and say, no, you know, there's got to be something wrong here. But there's this perception that, well, for certain people, that's okay, as long as it's not me. And that's many things. What it definitely is not is democratic, that every person in our system should have equal access to exercise their voice in saying what governance should come into effect. So that's sort of one piece of it. I think another piece of it is sort of coming from the first point that the state doesn't have an obligation, according to some people, to make its services understandable. And you can think about all the different areas where we actually demand that to be true. If you were applying, for example, not that it's perfect, but if you're trying to apply for a passport or get Social Security benefits or find your congressperson, you know, there would be a lot of upset if anything close to what Ms. Harrington described had to apply to any of those services. But because we think, and this is now the third point, and we just have to be real about it, that some people think, well, some people deserve to do that. And that is, to me, one of the most pernicious parts of this. You know, people in life make mistakes. Some of us, not all of us, get brought into court for it. And of that group, some of us get convicted for it. Those, you know, accountability moments are an opportunity to learn from the mistakes, and you know, deal with a penalty associated with that. That penalty shouldn't include your being barred from ever being a part of our political system. And that's really one of the challenges that I think, in terms of mindset, we have a really hard time letting go. We are, you know, as all the people on this panel know, we are a world leader, unfortunately, in incarcerating people. And that's not always for the purpose of rehabilitating. And so if we view this process, onerous as it obviously is, as a form of punishment, that goes back to what I described earlier, where the Fifth Circuit, at least a panel of the Fifth Circuit, said, you know, if this is a punishment, it's a cruel and unusual one, because people don't know when they've sort of turned the corner. They don't know how to get back into the system. And often, as has been really wonderfully described, and this happens in a lot of places, the rules change on you. So if we have to depend on the good graces of a judge or an elected official to say, okay, I've heard your case, for you, I will allow you back into the system, it's quite subject to arbitrary decision making. And that's not something that I think any of us would be very satisfied with if it were to apply to us. There should be a system. It should be obvious. It should be something that actually is easy for a person trying to figure this out to understand. And if people are trying to get their lives back on track, and this is the part that I find sort of the most ironic part of it, we're in an era where people are rethinking what it means to have second chances. Well, part of that has to mean being able to get back into the political system. And if that is an onerous burden that most people can't engage in, how do you expect them to take advantage of the second chance? That's the thing that I think we should be, at a 30,000-foot view in terms of values, thinking about as we're sort of crafting these policies. But yeah, everything that has been described shows that, you know, Tennessee, like a few states, just hasn't quite gotten that message.
Okay, Dr. Butt, it seems as though what we're looking at is punishment for some, and this is part of a continuation of punishment, and rehabilitation and giving individuals the rights that has gone out the window. From your research and perspective, where are we? Where can we go from here, knowing these facts?
Where I would love to see us go is everyone maintains their right to vote, right? We never have anyone losing their right to vote, regardless of conviction offense, how that conviction offense is classified, because we also know, right, those classifications are also subjective, right? Net widening, so to speak, increasing the number of felonies we have that could potentially, right, put you into this person-made category, right, that excludes you from your voting rights. So, you know, just to echo, you know, Ms. Harris and Mr. Creighton, it does almost, I equate it sometimes to watching a tennis match, right? So depending on who's in office, you know, depending on the executive orders that are being made, like Kentucky is a really good example, right? So you've had, what years, but it was 2015 to 2019, right? I think it was 3 different executive orders of like, this group of individuals can vote. Nope, we're going to rescind it. And then someone else goes back in office. And then, yes, now this group, the nonviolent felonies category, could then vote. So you do see this happening, right? This kind of tennis match. And do we want a right that is this important, right, to be in that type of an arena? So that's kind of my analogy, right, when we see this. So in the US, right, we have seen some positive movement, right? You have New Mexico, you have Minnesota. So, you know, individuals who are under community supervision can now vote in those states. We saw Washington, D.C. join Vermont and Maine, right? So if you have a conviction for a felony and you're a DC resident, you can still vote while you're incarcerated, even if you're housed somewhere within, right, the BOP, because there's an interesting relationship there between DC and the Bureau of Prisons, which can make it a little more, it does make it more complex for DC residents to vote if they're not in DC proper. But we've definitely seen with the South, it's, I will be blunt, it's a land of resistance to change, right? When it comes to voting rights. So, you've seen what I've called maybe some clarifications in some states. So going back to Alabama, we were chatting a little bit about Alabama before this started. So you have the crimes of moral turpitude, right? But they weren't defined. So you did have those defined, I believe it was in 2017. 47, if my number is correct, disqualifying offenses. So once they defined those offenses, you did have a handful of people, I think it was estimated to be mainly like about 60,000, who did get re-enfranchised because their specific crime type wasn't on that list, right? So where do we go next? It's, keeping this movement going forward, right? Building capacity. I think that's the one thing, at the Sentencing Project, we're a national hub. We work with individual states. We bring people together. We just recently had a voting rights convening where we had representation from over 30 states to chip away at this question, right? How do we get to universal suffrage? And then, of course, how do we end mass incarceration? So I would love to see the capacity building of our person power increase over time. I think that's going to be a huge difference. And, justice impacted individuals who are involved in this movement, they are the change makers. They, bring me hope and inspiration. And, just like Dawn, hearing these stories, it's, those are behind closed doors. Those need to become public knowledge, right? They need to be shouted from the rooftops because people would be enraged, right? If it actually took that to vote, right, to get your voting rights back. And it's just, in a country that values democracy, right, and participation, it's very abhorrent, right, that people have to go through this process to be able to come back to communities and be valued as community members, because the research shows us that. It tells us that losing that right to vote makes you feel like your voice doesn't matter, makes you feel like you're not part of the community. And our research supports that, right? We came out with a public safety and how that related to voting rights, and the research supports, right, having that right to vote. It's related to decreased recidivism, but more importantly, it's such a positive reintegration tool, right? So why would you not want to give everyone a very positive tool that can help them, right, when they come back to communities, and that can give them voice? So I guess that is my question for the lawmakers of the day, right? Why would you not want to provide this tool for folks?
All right, and one thing I think is important for us to stress, and you touched on this, is the fact that in most places in the world, the issue is whether you get to vote in prison. They all assume once you are released that you can vote. And so in the United States, it's gotten twisted because we're really at a backward stage in the argument, because the argument is, should those who have been released get to vote? And so what I want to look at is on the other side, there are many that believe you've given up this right, and you touched on it, Mr. Creighton. And can you give us some more on the issue of what are the arguments that you should not be able to vote once you have been released from prison?
Really, I wish I could give you like a full recitation, but they really do center around the sense that you have done something wrong, and that it is your job, if you will, your burden to carry to get back into the system. And it is just, that's what has to happen. You essentially, I would put it this way: you show your worthiness of being back into the political system by going through, all these Herculean tasks at the end of it. But I think it's important to note that, again, not everybody finds themselves in that position based on the type of crime that you might have been convicted with, or whether you even get prosecuted in the first place. These are discretionary decisions that early on, right, have some channeling effects of who gets in this position. But I'd also say, I do want to answer the question about what we do about it, because I think that's important. I mean, obviously, in the long term, we do need to do our best to dismantle these structures that we do find are, just en masse keeping people out of the political process. How do we get there? We're working, for example, in Florida. We were behind a lot of the effort, along with Florida groups, to get on the ballot because they have the ability to put ballot measures in Florida to create a pathway for people who are trying to get back into the system. Now, as you know, has been said before, politics matters. We then got a governor in Florida who decided to try to undermine what the people had decided. And so there's litigation right now that we're helping with, both in terms of trying to make good on the commitment that Florida voters have provided, but then also trying to undo some of the additional damage that some politicians have put into place to prosecute people who thought they were requalified, who the state had said were requalified, but then they get prosecuted for misunderstanding the information that the state provided to them, and they're being criminally prosecuted. So again, it's sort of this mentality that we have to undermine. But in the short term, we've got to go in and make sure that these folks who are trying to get back on track have backup, that they're not further punished for trying to do nothing more than what we think the Constitution allows them to do. But the second thing that I think we do need to do, and I appreciate what Dr. Flood said earlier, is to really work at highlighting the stories about what this means for people. And, you know, I said, and I, you know, underscored again, what Ms. Harrington offered was really powerful testimony. It's in some ways sad that we have to, you know, have those stories told. We should want that to happen. I bless Ms. Harrington for sharing it. But, you know, it costs something to be public about what can, for many people, not all, be a painful part of their story that they're trying to move through. And so we should start shifting the conversation to not what these, you know, citizens who are trying to be able to exercise their rights are going through, but what is it about us that makes us so connected to this notion that we have to continue to punish people? So that involves, you know, communications. It involves making certain that politicians, as we said, understand that what they're saying about what criminal justice is supposed to be may not be what's being practiced on the ground, and to talk about what we can do to change it. Last thing I'll say, I know we're short on time. We talked about Alabama. I happen to be from Alabama, and I will tell you the other big problem is these pathways are created like a pardon system, and the pardon boards don't meet. And so they say that there's going to be a system and that there's going to be the opportunity to get back in, but people don't even actually sit down to consider cases. And so we should start putting pressure on elected officials to make real the promises they offer for political purposes, but don't want to come through when the time comes to actually do the work. We should demand that to be true, and everybody should be making that argument, not just people who have to show up and go through this process. So I just say, even in our states that have sort of embraced this notion, we need to push them to at least make good on the systems that they create, while we also think about how to fundamentally shift our systems to be more representative and more open to make certain that people really get serious second chances to be part of our society.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you one last question, but I do want to say this. I have noticed that in the nonprofit sector here in Tennessee, we have a number of individuals that purport to be for helping people formerly incarcerated through a number of programs and initiatives. I've always questioned why, if you are pro helping individuals, you don't make it easier for them to vote so they can help themselves in this true fashion. I'm going to ask you a question, fill in the blank. I'll start with you, Ms. Harrington. To expand voting rights in this country, we need more what? Blank.
We need more grassroots organizing.
All right. Stephanie Harris. To expand voting rights in this country, or even this city, we need more blank.
Buy-in. We need the people who want to, who need their voting rights restored. We need their buy-in. And I understand the fact that a lot of them don't have it, because when they're coming out of prison, they don't know where they're going to live. You know, so, you know, getting their voting rights restored is not high on their list at, you know, right in the midst of all of that. And then we need it from the broader community. We have Mr. Creighton's point. You made a mistake, live with it. sort of mentality. You are where you are because of the decisions that you make mentality. And so we need buy-in from the broader community, and we need help. We need the broader community to buy in, and we need them to even help the people that don't necessarily know that this is the assistance that they need, in addition to the other services that are provided.
Oh, definitely ditto that, because I myself have experienced pushback in the broader community when I even talk about this subject of helping people who have been formerly incarcerated. All right, thank you for that. All right, Mr. Creighton, to expand voting rights in this country or wherever we are, we need more blank.
I'm going to use a foreign word that is as simple as anybody in the South would understand. The foreign word learned in South Africa, it's Ubuntu. It is the notion that I am only because you are, that I can't be me unless I regard the humanness, the love in you. And if that doesn't sound like stuff that you've heard in church, then I want to think about, like, I can point you to places where that is. We need to understand that our health and wellness as a democracy or as individuals really depends on making sure that everybody is okay. And this policy is exactly the kind of space that I think gets in the way of that. So we need more people practicing and living Ubuntu.
All right, and Dr. Bud, to expand voting rights in this country, we need more blank.
It would say, if I say research, is that too on the nose? I mean, research is a tool, right? And just one really quick comment is that research does show us, like, this matters in all realms of life. Like, losing the right to vote, it's actually been shown to affect people's health outcomes, right? So it has health implications. And I think oftentimes we may not realize the trickle effect, so to speak, right? But for me, I go back to the human capacity, which I think kind of encapsulates what all of my colleagues have said here today, is, really building that momentum and that movement, getting buy-in, but then also having, folks go out there and beat the drum for justice, if I may borrow Brian Stevenson's phrase. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. And I'll borrow from what has become one of my favorite book casts. We as a society really have to look at the historic barriers that we've had for individuals to really live in a society that values merit over position or color or sex or any sort of sexual orientation. We need to really have a meritocracy in this country. And once we view people as equal, once we really move toward equity and justice in our society, that's part of the mission of the YWCA, then we'll truly understand why all of these barriers are there and move them out of the way. It really just takes the will of the individuals in our community to make this so. I'm appalled at the number of people that don't vote who have the option of voting in our society, and then to place barriers on those who have a desire to be a part of this so-called democratic society. That's really heartbreaking. I thank these panelists today. We've had real world experiences. We've had the research. We've had those who have studied this. And the conclusion at the end of the day is we're going to have to work harder as a community to make sure that all people in our community have the right to the basics of voting. And that includes those who are formerly incarcerated. It should not be something that carries on after you leave prison. We do know that we're an outlier on the world stage, and I thank you very much for this conversation. I thank those of you who attended. And so this completes our webinar. If you do have the opportunity to be downtown tomorrow between 11:30 and 1, join us on the courthouse steps. And so we'll further this discussion and continue this discussion. We also have a survey if you have the opportunity to fill out. We always want to be better. We always want other subjects that you want us to look at and have these valid community discussions. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.